there is this curious belief that regulation as such is a good thing. I mean, regulation is just law in its overalls. You will never hear anybody say, we need more law. I don't know what it is, we just need more of it. But you will frequently hear people say, we need more regulation. Now, there is this curious idea out there that regulation can somehow prevent financial crises, which I think is, transparent nonsense. If you run an absurdly lax monetary policy into a boom, you will get a financial crisis. There is absolutely nothing the regulator can do about it. The interesting thing is, a financial crisis is the time where you will see dishonesty, if there is dishonesty to be seen. The interesting thing about this financial crisis is we left the children locked in the sweet shop all night and they don't seem to have touched the sweets. What has happened is, ineptitude, if you want to call it that, a collective and extraordinary misestimation of aggregate risk levels in the system. But if the regulators had not been doing their job properly, we should by now have been seeing hard evidence of real dishonesty, and there has been no sign of that. Actually, what the crisis seems to have shown is the regulatory system was doing its job rather well, and it is slightly unfair to blame it for not preventing the crisis, because that's not what it's for, and that's not something that it can achieve. But going to where regulation comes from, and particularly I think the UK has been very slow in appreciating that financial regulation is no longer a UK concern, it is a European concern. There is a terrible tendency in London to look at what is coming out of Europe and say, this is mad, this is damaging, therefore it must be a French conspiracy to injure London. Well, it is mad, a lot of it is damaging, some of it may be a French conspiracy, but the people who are going to get hit hardest for the lot of this are Paris and Frankfurt. And I think we tend to forget that a lot of what is coming out of Europe is not motivated by a sort of narrow-minded dislike of London. It's motivated by a broad dislike of finance generally. And that's really the problem we need to engage with.
Yes. Michael, do you want to come back on any of what Simon has said? Because, I mean, that came pretty close to being a defense of pre-crisis light touch regulation, which is not something one hears very often these days.
Well, yeah, my motto this year has been, let's be optimistic. Pessimism is for better times. And I feel that, moving on to an optimistic note, I think Simon does give us an interesting chink there. To me, the thing we failed to do, and Chris alluded to this, is we failed to make the case for finance. And the city is a very diffuse place. We have, FX, insurance, reinsurance, shipping, commodities, trading. We've allowed what is effectively a complicated interaction of, and I do think regulators have some blame, but I think it's a complex system that's fallen apart. Fractional reserve banking, regulation, oligopoly in the case of British banks, where we have a problem in the banking industry. And that's spilled over to the entirety of the city. And I don't think the city has fought that hard enough. We've sort of said, well, just leave us alone, and obviously it's there. But you go out and you talk to people in the countryside, and I went to talk to Occupy London last Tuesday, and my colleague claims he got fleas, but they were actually fairly rational people. They had sensible and interesting questions, but they didn't understand the distinction between the various bits of the city. I think we need to raise our game on that and make the case for finance. As far as regulation and light touch, I wrote a book on it where I claimed, quite honestly, that regulation was a large part of the crisis, but in an interesting way. It's because it encouraged homogeneity, particularly in the banking sector. And in fact, if you look at the largely unregulated bits of finance, you do find that they're the ones that function better. And this is no different than Andrew Tyree, who wrote a piece back in 2000 on Leviathan at Large, where he pointed out that the FSA not having a remit for competition was going to lead to further oligopoly, and that this would be the areas that you would see the system fail in. And broadly speaking, that's been the case. It's been where the system has a high degree of concentration, typically characterized by lack of competition. And regulation helps that. Regulation is a barrier to entry. Regulation is a cost. I've certainly know clients who say, bring it on. And there's some of you in the audience who are from a bank, a client of mine who in 1996 had as one of the 5 strategic objectives for the year, bullet point 3 was to become too big to be allowed to fail. And that was their strategic target that year, and they achieved it. They're still around. So, you know, banks are very clear what's going on in that area, but that's not the city. And I think we need to make the case for general finance, and where reform is needed, I think we do need to lead on this. And I don't think it's a simple more regulation, less regulation. I think Simon and I would be in agreement on that. It's a nuance to the bits that need to be regulated.
Simon, could I just pick you up on one further point, which is that I entirely agree with you that the tide of monetary policy is infinitely more important than regulation. Regulation can't stop financial crises if it's running against monetary policy. But what regulation does do, palpably, is to shift business from one centre to another because of regulatory arbitrage responding to these signals. Do you think, London be competing on a strong regulatory system, or do you think that the nature of global competition is such that you have to accept that you have to drop standards in order to win business? Because particularly if you're looking at the moment, say, at the IPO market across the world, there are lots of signs that standards are falling. There's a huge degree of regulatory arbitrage, including some very curious arbitrage between China and New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, which is partly based on the fact that the NYSE and NASDAQ have less strong regulation against related party transactions than you get in Hong Kong. Now, what should London do? Should it be dropping standards? Should it be boasting about the strength of its regulation?
Well, there's a simple answer to that, and there's a slightly more complex answer. I mean, the simple answer goes back to the earlier discussion we were having about emerging markets. All emerging markets are absolutely clear that to attract business, they have to strengthen their regulatory standards. So, I mean, you can run a simple argument. This proves that more regulation, that stronger regulation is actually beneficial to the centre. And I think there's some...
Except that Singapore at the moment has been engaged in a discussion about reducing the sanctions against directors of bad behaviour. So something very interesting is going on there.
But I mean, the slightly more sophisticated answer is that you have to look at regulation really on a sort of 2x2 grid, and you can place any individual rule. And one axis is, you know, does it actually achieve anything useful? And the other axis is how onerous is it to comply with. Now, because no regulation is ever repealed, every financial centre has a clump of stuff in the achieves very little but costs a fortune box. When people talk about deregulation, what they generally mean is getting rid of what's in that quadrant. And sort of intelligent regulation, if you like, involves trying to migrate as much of your system as possible from sort of the top left, you know, cost of fortune doesn't achieve very much. Many people would say an awful lot of SEC regulation is in that box, down towards the easier to comply with and actually achieves rather more quadrant. And you know, the final point is, when we talk about regulation, remember what you are talking about is a complex of several thousand rules. So at any given time, you will have a scatter all over that chart. And from time to time, there will be one particular rule that causes immense pain and gets itself changed or altered. So the fact that, you know, one or two rules are being changed in one or two particular directions is an essential part of the way you run a system. But it makes it quite hard to sort of plot regulatory systems on a simple graph between sort of higher and lower, just because it's more complicated than that.